This is part 4 of our exegesis of John chapter 11. You might want to turn there. We're looking at the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. In looking at this story, we're making a point to see this for what it is. It's a real story about real people with real emotions, people facing huge obstacles in their life, people who are just like us, people who sometimes misunderstand what God's doing in their lives. This story is about people who get mad at God for not doing things the way they expected. And the idea is for us to learn vicariously from their failings. Vicarious, that's a great word. In this case, to me, vicarious means to look at life through your eyes, watch you make mistakes, and learn from your mistakes in a way that cost me little more than a little time. I usually learn from my mistakes, but that's painful. That can be expensive. I'd a lot rather just learn from somebody else's mistakes. That's what we can do with this story. So let's see in this story about Lazarus what we can learn vicariously. We saw how we have to be flexible when we get a word of knowledge because we may not understand it completely or correctly. Even when the word seems clear, we still have to seek God and remain open to confirmation. That's what happened to Jesus, I think. He heard a word saying that this sickness is not to Lazarus' death. It appeared that he assumed that means that Lazarus isn't going to die from the sickness, when actually the word meant Lazarus isn't going to stay dead from this sickness. Martha clearly heard Jesus tell her that Lazarus would be raised from the dead. Jesus meant today, but she thought he meant someday. Here's another example of misunderstanding. Martha and Mary both were certain that Jesus had goofed up by not coming and healing Lazarus right away. So again, because they misunderstood, they got angry at God. We'll see later in the story that the religious leaders of the day, they totally misunderstood what was going on. You know what all these misunderstandings tell me? Life ain't perfect, and we'll never get it all right. Matter of fact, I have a saying for that. One of my sayings for life is, we're just bumbling along, doing the best we can. We're just bumbling along, doing the best we can. And this is the good news about that. God knows that we're just bumbling along, doing the best we can. God knows that our information is usually partial, it's not complete. God knows that we often misunderstand life and what's going on. Our bumbling along is no surprise to God. Listen to this. It's no surprise to God if for no other reason than the fact that Jesus had to go through this kind of messed up human life too, just like we do. He understands. Take heart when you fail. The Lord is patient and kind. He's always with you. He'll never leave you. He'll stay with you working through things until, if possible, you finally understand His words correctly. When you fall down, He's there to say, hey, let me help you up. And oh, by the way, I still love you. So don't be a perfectionist with yourself, okay? That's never going to work. Remember, life is horseshoes and hand grenades. About the best we can do is get close to doing the right thing all the time. Don't get into condemnation. Don't sweat the small stuff. Keep moving generally forward, pressing toward the mark of the high calling of God. At least that's one of the things that I've seen from this story so far. Now, what we're going to see next in this story is revealing about the nature of God. I want you to be watching for this toward the end, where we see evidence of God's emotions that are actually triggered by our emotions. I'll prove to you from Scripture that God's compassion for us actually includes empathy and sympathy. If Martha and Mary had only understood this about the nature of Jesus, they would have never accused him of not caring about Lazarus. Unfortunately, most of us have never been around people who who are as empathetic, who are as sympathetic or compassionate as Jesus is. And so we just figure that Jesus can't be like that either, because we've never experienced that from anybody in our lives. Well, stay with me today and learn about this important truth, okay? Well, let's pick up where we left off in the story with Martha going to get Mary, okay? John 11, starting in verse 28. We're going to read 28 through 30. John 11, 28 through 30. When she, Martha, had said this, she went away, and she called Mary her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here, and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she quickly got up and was going to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Notice that Martha doesn't say much to Mary. She definitely wasn't impressed with what she had heard from Jesus. I mean, she wasn't excited at all that Jesus had arrived. He was too late. But Mary, whether out of anticipation or maybe just out of anger, she hurries to see Jesus. Jesus and the disciples, they're waiting there under the trees at that roadside kiosk. At least that's how I see it in my mind. And let's go on to verse 31 and see what happens. So it says, "Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there." The Jews, it says here, followed her. Well, since about everybody in this story is Jews, this has to refer to the Jewish religious leaders of the day. My translation, and probably yours, said that they suspected that Mary was going out to the tomb to weep. But actually the word that's used here is wail, not weep. Weep is crying, maybe sobbing. Wailing is crying out loudly with loud groanings. A person weeping may go unnoticed. A person wailing, that's different. They're going to attract lots of attention. And apparently, in those days, the more attention you attracted at a funeral, the better. The Jewish customs of the day at a funeral were different than ours are today. Today, if somebody's body dies, they fall asleep, they pass on, whatever you want to call it. The loved ones actually cry and mourn. Maybe they even sob, but it's usually fairly quiet. By the time the funeral and the burial come around, most of the loved ones have pretty well cried themselves out. The Jews at this time, however, they were very loud. They were demonstrative. They were boisterous after a death. Let me show you an example. Mark 5:36 through 42. Mark 5:36 through 42. Let me just kind of pick up in the middle of the story. But Jesus, overhearing what was being said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And Jesus allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw commotion, and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, Jesus said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? This child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him, but putting them out. He took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha koum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up, began to walk. She was about 12 years old, and immediately they were completely astonished. Okay, we're picking up this story in kind of in the middle. This is where the synagogue official's daughter has passed on. Jesus is coming to the house, and along the way they get the message she's died. Well, when Jesus gets there, there's a great crowd of people weeping and wailing. The translation says there was a big commotion. That means it was noisy and chaotic. You can imagine the same thing around Lazarus' house. Now look at verse 40 there. When Jesus tells them that the girl is not dead, they laugh at him. Now wait a minute. I thought they were weeping and wailing and sad. How in the world do you laugh at somebody in the middle of that? Well, in that culture, for whatever reason, they had decided that the more noise you made and the more anguish you showed, that somehow showed how much you cared about the person that had passed on. And it was all about the noise and the show. It wasn't really about real feelings. It wasn't uncommon, if you had the money, to hire professional mourners. They'd come over to your house or to the gravesite. They'd weep and wail and carry on. Here, now maybe none of these were hired mourners, but the hired mourners maybe didn't even know who the departed was. They were just paid to make lots of noise, make the grieving look good. Now to us, that sounds silly. It sounds empty. But in these days, if there wasn't a lot of noise and wailing going on, then you weren't really at a funeral. Now, there's no indication that Martha and Mary had hired mourners, but for sure there would have been a commotion going on. Lots of wailing was expected. So if Mary's going to the gravesite to wail and mourn, then all the friends and the neighbors are going to go join her in the wailing and mourning. They wouldn't want her to think that they didn't care, and so that's the kind of crowd that was following behind Mary when she approaches Jesus. Okay, let's go back to John 11:32. John 11:32. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So, what was the first thing out of Mary's mouth to Jesus? Obviously, Mary and Martha had been talking about this, because independently they said exactly the same thing when they got to Jesus. Debbie and I were reading through this chapter the other day, and when we got to this verse, I asked her, can you read into this verse anything other than Mary accusing Jesus? And she said, no. This has to be accusing Jesus of getting it wrong. Well, Mary and Martha had been playing a very dangerous game. They'd been playing the blame game. When something this awful happens, it has to be somebody's fault. They were grumbling and complaining. They were feeding on each other's grumbling. Jesus obviously didn't get things right, and they were going to give him a piece of their mind. They had to be talking among themselves, saying, since Jesus dilly-dallied around and he didn't get here when we called him, Lazarus died. Lazarus' condition is permanent now, but it was so preventable. It's all Jesus' fault, and we're really upset at him. If only Jesus had been here. That's how they were talking to themselves. They weren't just in mourning, they were also angry at Jesus. And on top of that, they were grumbling and complaining. When most of us get ourselves in a situation where we're being blamed or something, what's the first thing we do? Well, we start trying to explain, justify ourselves, maybe make excuses, right? We don't want people hanging all kinds of blame on us. We got to protect ourselves, protect our reputation. At the least, we have to protect ourselves from any liability. Shoot, we might get sued. We might have to pay restitution. Our pay might get docked or something. But do you see any kind of response like that from Jesus to Mary? Actually, Jesus just kind of ignores her accusation. Why did Jesus ignore the accusation instead of vigorously defend himself? Well, let's go back to what Jesus said about himself. He said that he was in the Father was in him, and the result of that relationship was that Jesus never did anything he didn't first hear from the Father. In other words, he wasn't driving the car. He wasn't in charge. It wasn't up to Jesus to decide what to do and what not to do. In childlike submission, Jesus did just whatever Abba told him to do. Well, Mary and Martha had been grumbling and complaining against Jesus, right? But if this tragedy wasn't the fault of Jesus, because he was just following what his Father said, then who were they really grumbling and complaining against? They were grumbling against God. Listen, anytime we're grumbling and complaining about anything or anyone, we're really complaining against God. Remember when the Israelites complained to Moses about the wilderness? And then when Moses brings that complaint to God, what does God tell Moses? Man, God is furious at the Israelites because they're grumbling and complaining against Him, the one who always has their best interest in mind, and they're complaining against Him. God was the one calling the shots and directing the course, not Moses. So if people didn't like what was going on, then they were saying that they didn't think God was doing a very good job. Do you really want to put yourself in opposition to God by complaining? God said that doing that brings curses down on yourself. Debbie and I have made a pact with each other. If one of us catches the other one grumbling and complaining, we tell them, hey, you're grumbling and complaining. That way they'll know what they're doing so they can stop opposing God. And so they can stop pulling curses down on us and our family. Well, let's go back to Jesus' non-reaction here to Martha and Mary. You know, if I'm in Jesus and Jesus is in me, then I'm letting Jesus live His life through me. Who gets healed, who gets a word of knowledge, who gets help, that's really not up to me. And I can't afford to get all huffy and defensive when somebody makes an accusation against me, especially one that I know isn't founded. Hey, I'm in Jesus. Complain to Him, I can say to myself. As I absorb their slings and arrows, at least that's the way I want to learn to react, you know. You know, that's easy to do with somebody that you don't know very well. You don't know them, they don't know you, who cares? But when it's somebody that's really close to you who starts accusing you, oh man, it's so hard to sit back and take it and not react. Or even better, we ought to react to them in love, right? But the closer they are to us, the harder that is to do, it seems. Debbie and I are learning to be sweet to each other all the time. It's tough because we love each other. Okay, John 11:33 through 35. When Jesus therefore saw her, Mary, weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, He was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And He said, Where have you laid him? They said to Him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Let me help you with some of the words here in this passage. Where it says that Mary and the Jewish leaders were weeping, that's really the word for wailing. Wailing can be real weeping and real shedding of tears, or it can be more of a theatrical show of grieving emotions. But when it says that Jesus wept, that's the word for crying. That's the word for real tears that result from deep emotions. This is the shortest verse in the Bible, and it used to trouble me. Why was Jesus so deeply touched that He would cry? I mean, Jesus knew that Lazarus was just asleep, and Jesus knew that Lazarus was within minutes of being brought back to life to all of these good folks. Why would Jesus be crying at this time? Listen, the answer to this question is so important, I think. If you get nothing else out of this teaching series, get the answer to this question. Why did Jesus cry? I think verse 33 gives us the clue we need to understand Jesus crying. It says that He was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. Well, what troubled Jesus? I think it was that He saw everybody around Him weeping and wailing. They were sad to the core. This loss of Lazarus had brought them into the deepest depression. Even knowing the outcome here, Jesus still felt empathy for them. Empathy is the emotion that we feel when we're feeling someone else's emotions. You've experienced this with your children. I remember one time when Sandy, she's about 3, we were at the grocery store where they had balloons at the time, and she got one. These are helium-filled balloons, so they floated. And we wrapped the string around the handle of the grocery cart, and explained to Sandy, now you got to leave the string there because otherwise the balloon's going to fly away. Well, when we got outside, going to the car, Sandy decided to unwrap the balloon so she could take it home with her. You know what happened next, of course. She loosened her grip on that string for just a moment and the balloon floated away. She cried out, "Daddy, my balloon!" as if there was anything I could do about it. And when she saw that balloon was not coming back, she began to cry and wail, "My balloon, my balloon!" I felt so bad for her. I could feel her sense of loss. That's empathy. Debbie went back to college later in life. When she graduated, I actually shed a couple of tears. I was happy for her and her accomplishment. That's empathy, where you actually feel the emotion that somebody else is feeling. Look at this scripture. Jesus has empathy for us. Jesus feels our emotions, and in this case, he felt those emotions deeply and passionately. Please get this picture. When you're suffering, Jesus is suffering right along with you. When you're happy and elated, Jesus is happy and elated right along with you. Jesus shares our joys, but he also shares our deepest sorrows. When you're going through dark times, when it seems like everybody's against you and your world is about to come to an abrupt end, take a minute in the Spirit to look around, and you'll find Jesus weeping right along with you. Go with me to Hebrews 4, verse 15. The book of Hebrews, chapter 4, and verse 15. A lovely verse. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Our high priest Jesus sympathizes with us. The word sympathize here means to commiserate with or have empathy with, to share the feelings of someone who is suffering. This is who we serve. This is who lives inside of us. This is Jesus. I want to show this to you kind of from another way around, okay? Go to Matthew 5 and verse 7. Matthew 5 and 7. From the Beatitudes it says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." The word here that's translated mercy is this Greek word eleo that I told you about before, E-L-E-E-O. This Greek word actually means empathy and compassion for someone in such a way that it motivates you to help alleviate their suffering. Now, that's a great word. Let me read the definition again. It means to have empathy and compassion for someone in such a way that it motivates you to help alleviate their suffering. To have empathy and compassion for someone in such a way that you actually help them. This is a great word. It's a shame we don't have a similar word in English. I mean, we could say that someone has empathy and compassion. That's close, I guess, but it's still not complete. Now, maybe the English word mercy means something different now than it did in the King James era. Today, mercy is all about reducing the punishment. You know, for someone, they've done something wrong, they deserve the punishment, but for whatever reason, you show them mercy by reducing or eliminating their punishment. Well, that's not even close to the Greek word eleo, what that means. Our word mercy may or may not have anything to do with empathy and compassion. Eleo is all about empathy and compassion, and so much of it that it motivates you to help the person. Almost everywhere you see the English word mercy in the New Testament, it's actually from this Greek word eleo, empathy and compassion. When the New Testament says that Jesus had mercy, we know now that he had deep empathy and compassion. Well, yeah, Father Dan, but Jesus wasn't speaking Greek. He wasn't actually using eleo. Well, okay. What kind of Hebrew word might Jesus have used? We can look into the Old Testament to see that. Go with me to Ezekiel 39:25. Ezekiel 39 and verse 25. Through the prophet, therefore, thus says the Lord God, now I will restore the fortunes of Jacob, and I will have mercy on the house of Israel, and I will be jealous for my holy name. Yahweh will have mercy on Israel. Well, not quite. In our modern English, mercy means to reduce or eliminate a punishment. You have mercy, and you can have that without compassion or empathy. But listen, this Hebrew word here that's used here, that's translated mercy, it's a word that literally means to fondle. Fondle means to touch or handle lovingly, to show affection for, to have great empathy and sympathy for someone. The Hebrew word depicts strong emotions of compassion towards someone. Can you imagine asking the judge, "Oh, judge, fondle me"? You see what I mean? It's not even close to the American or the English word mercy. So even in the Old Testament, the English word that's translated mercy is a poor translation. The Hebrew word that's translated into mercy, almost in every case in the Old Testament, means great empathy and compassion and sympathy. It comes literally from the word to fondle, like you'd fondle your child or a grandchild. So let's go back to where we were in the story of Lazarus. Because of his deep empathy and compassion for people around him, all the people, not just Mary and Martha, very quickly felt all the grief and all the sadness and all the emotional distress that they were all feeling over the loss of Lazarus. All those strong emotions, all of those things that everybody else was feeling. Jesus felt that, and they were manifested in the tears of Jesus. Again, if you get nothing out of this teaching but this, see the clear picture of Jesus, your brother, who feels every emotion you feel. And like the Greek word elio, that sympathy isn't just a feeling to be felt. It's a feeling that because of his great compassion and love, literally drives Jesus to help us in time of need. When we're weeping, Jesus is right there weeping with us. When you're happy and elated, Jesus is right there doing a happy dance with you. We don't serve a God who is not touched by our emotions, but a God who literally feels everything that we feel. And because He's God, He may actually feel our emotions more deeply than we do. Just think about that for a minute. Jesus felt the deep grief and sadness all around Him, so much that it made Him cry with them, even though He knew what was about to happen and the joy that was about to come. Well, this is a great thought for us to wrap up with today. There are just lots of nuggets in this story. Come back next time, we'll find some more nuggets.